The stock rocket launcher is undoubtedly one of the most reliable weapons in Team Fortress 2. Its extreme simplicity, complemented by its clip capacity, mobility options, and effective destructive capabilities against both man and machine, make it an excellent weapon for new arrivals to the battlefield, and a deadly piece of armament in the hands of experienced players who can expertly exploit each of its mechanics. But this film is not for the express purpose of showcasing a regular Team Fortress 2 item. Rather, we will today introduce a new weapon to the field of battle, a possible replacement for the beloved stock rocket launcher, and hopefully will teach you how to use it correctly. The Direct Hit is a new type of rocket launcher, issued and supplied to your team via Manco. It is similar in appearance to the stock weapon, with the exception of a wider forward section and a scope added purely for aesthetic purposes. In a statistical comparison with a stock rocket launcher, the Direct Hit deals 25% more damage. Her rockets travel 80% faster, and any targets propelled skyward either via your own damage or by a player's own volition can be subject to a mini-crit if you can land a rocket on them whilst they're airborne. All of this, however, comes at the cost of rockets dealing 70% less splash damage. That is, damage caused by rockets only exploding on surfaces near a target rather than connecting with them. The remaining portion of this film will aim on providing instruction on how to appropriately utilize this new weapon in the field. Before that, however, it should be noted that this film only concerns itself with the Direct Hit's application in a casual field experience, and does not claim to accurately portray the weapon's capabilities in a competitive setting. Now let's take a look at this Direct Hit business. You'd be forgiven for assuming that this weapon would best compete at long range, considering the rocket's speed and damage makes it easier and more rewarding to engage long-distance targets on ground usually not suitable for the stock rocket launcher. However, it is the opinion of this training film that the Direct Hit is actually most effective at medium to close range and is best suited under a doctrine of aggression. For the Direct Hit projectile, despite its damage increase, is still victim to damage fall-off, and the most harm you can usually hope to inflict when firing at a long-distance target is 30 to 59 points of health. On the contrary, the Direct Hit fired at close range can deal around 140 damage, and a close-range shot on an air target, providing a mini-crit, can deal upwards of 180 damage. It's important you understand precisely what these numbers mean. This immense power means you can kill a scout, an engineer, a sniper, and a spy, each with a single rocket, and assuming no extra health is obtained by your opponent, a second shot will easily kill the remaining 5 classes in the game, with the exception of the heavy, whose lumbering mobility options will often impede any chance he might make to escape before a third shot is fired. There is no other weapon in the soldier's primary arsenal capable of dispensing so much damage so consistently and reliably. Of course, all this potential destruction relies on your skill and ability to land those shots in the first place. Firing on engineer buildings is easy enough, considering their stationary nature. However, aiming at moving players requires prediction. Now, if it weren't for Team Fortress 2's chaotic atmosphere, this film might propose a careful, mathematical equation to players for them to follow in order to consistently land rockets. It doesn't take a veteran to know that formulas and calculations are easily lost in the unpredictable and confusing order of a TF2 match. Instinct and intuition are the real deciding factors in what breaks or makes a successful attack. A good rule of thumb to follow when preparing for any fight in Team Fortress 2 is that good positioning is king. It is impossible to execute any good field strategy so long as you're in a bad spot. This especially applies to the Direct Hit. To determine what makes a good position, we must first contemplate what the Direct Hit can and can't do. For example, consider how much the conventional soldier relies upon splash damage, and how much he shapes his positioning around this. We Direct Hit soldiers need not bother with such a concern, for our weapon's very nature only requires that we have a line of sight with the target and adequate range between us. As a result, the Direct Hit is, in a sense, more versatile in dissimilar environments than the stock rocket launcher is. It's also much easier to hit an opponent hard so long as he isn't looking at you. If your enemy is focused on something ahead of him, then would be the time to strike, as chances are he's dodging in anticipation of fire coming from in front, which usually does nothing to invalidate fire coming from his sides. It's also important to remember you're playing as the soldier, arguably the most maneuverable class in the game. If a position superior to yours is in sight, or your current position becomes no longer maintainable, you can always rocket jump to more favorable terrain. As for the complicated business of aiming, taking your time is a good first step. Inexperienced players miss frequently because they simply overreact to minor enemy movement and over-exaggerate their lead. And although, as mentioned, the field can be an unpredictable place, oftentimes individual player actions are anything but. For example, when scouts find themselves dueling other players, they like to utilize their double jump to move in the direction opposite their first jump. You can use this to map out a flight path for the scout to follow, and as long as you exercise patience, a direct hit is easy to land. This is just one of many behaviors subconsciously exercised by players which, through understanding and patience, you can exploit to get an edge. The unique nature of the direct hit also enables for the plausibility of a few niche tactics. For instance, the massive close-range damage offered by the direct hit allows for assassinations, as has been dubbed by this film. This maneuver is simply exercised by sighting a low-health target within rocket range, performing a quick jump, placing you close to said target, and then killing them with a single rocket before retreating back to friendly territory. This can be done in a matter of seconds, and is especially handy for neutralizing those threats that can output great influence onto the field, whether it be team support or high pinpoint damage. The medic, engineer, and sniper being obvious examples. And although these targets usually benefit from the protection of power classes around them, the assassination can be performed so quickly that the target's teammates have no time to react. You'll also recall how towards the beginning of this film, we suggested that long-range combat is not to be relied on as an effective way of putting out damage, but the direct hit's rocket speed does allow for one exception. When you see an enemy running away, clearly heading for the spawn, it wouldn't hurt at all to fire at least one rocket at them. Most players are not used to the speed of the direct hit, and though the 59 damage may seem measly, it's often more than enough to finish off a wounded player. This tactic is made much easier if the target is also moving down a tight lane of travel. For the final portion of this film, we will discuss attacking airborne targets, a task that arguably no other weapon is better suited for. The fast rocket and the mini-crit bonus for hitting aloft targets give skilled players the ability to effectively neutralize targets attacking from the sky, essentially granting their own team air superiority. Once again, positioning is the key. There are a few common and well-known tricks that can help you contest flyers, such as walking towards a market gardener as he makes his ascent, rather than falling back, and how the best time to fire an air shot is when the target is at the climax of their jump, which is when they've stopped gaining altitude and are at their slowest. However, this film will challenge conventional wisdom on effective positioning by claiming the following. When you are facing an enemy whose primary offensive capabilities depend entirely on them gaining altitude over you via a rocket jump, sticky jump, or other propelled flight, it is most advantageous for the airshotting soldier to assume the lower ground, not the high ground. This conclusion will be supported by the following 3 demonstrations. These presentations stage the likely outcomes of 3 separate engagements between a direct hit soldier and a market gardener. These engagements are only distinct from one another thanks to the positioning assumed by each combatant. Of course, the most opportune time to fire at a jumper would be when he is flying perpendicular to you. That way his entire flight path, including his climax, is victim to attack. These demonstrations, however, are only concerned with defeating enemy jumpers targeting you specifically. This market gardener arguably has the best chance of safely hitting our soldier. Recall how we established earlier that it's best for a direct hit soldier to fire when the market gardener has reached the climax of his flight path. But in this instance, by the time the soldier has reached his climax, he's had more than enough time to connect his shovel. Suppose this second example. Both soldiers are on even terrain. The direct hit has better odds here than in the last example, and contrary to what we suggested earlier, here it would make sense to fall back further away from the jumper, as the more distance built, the higher his arc will have to be. Of course, movement should only be made before the jumper has left the ground. This way, the soldier has to expose more of his flight path to you and stay in the air longer, providing you more time to take a shot. If we're also assuming the jumper has only the ground and no wall to jump off of, his flight path will have to be compensated for, either thanks to its altitude or by the amount of strafing required to stay on target. Now behold this third and final demonstration. The market gardener has the high ground now, but this means his flight path will look much larger than he probably would like. This means that the jumper's only choice is launching himself directly skyward, exposing his entire flight path, and providing the direct hit soldier an adequate line of fire. It is clear then by these demonstrations that when facing off against a market gardener, you should consolidate and control what terrain would most easily place the jumper's flight path in an awkward, timely, and yet predictable angle. Let's conclude with a review. To effectively use the direct hit, it is most advisable to understand the importance of good positioning, the relevance of damage numbers, how and when is best to engage flying targets, and how and why to launch surprise attacks.